All right. Hello, everyone. Here, we want to start on time and respect your time. Welcome. My name is Lisa Janetian. I'm a professor here at the Stanford School of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Child and Family Policy. Thanks for being here, everyone. Today's lecture is part of the Early Childhood Initiative Series, which seeks to bring together scholars to address challenges and produce world-class scholarship that aims to maximize the potential of children, especially during the early childhood years. And the speakers that we've brought through the series range in their disciplines and their expertise, sharing common a passion and a commitment to contribute to policy and practice, and you're certainly going to get a glimpse of that today. Please silence your phone. My remarks. It's really a pleasure to introduce Chloe Gift. A delight to have her on campus. Chloe studies how public investments in education, especially early in life, translate into outcomes for children, their families, communities, and educational systems. She's a senior economist presently at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research and a faculty affiliate at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Educational Initiatives, where she directs the Early Childhood Policy Lab. From 2022 to 2023, Chloe served as the White House as a senior economist with the President's Council of Economic Advisors, focusing on child and family policy. And it's not here, but I just want to name that Chloe really elevated questions and dilemmas and puzzles around childcare during that time. So I am just really delighted to bring Chloe over here to the podium. She is a scholar that can speak to topics that are very timely in North Carolina in the early education and child care space, and really at the frontiers of pushing some of our policy puzzles and dilemmas in moving this work forward. Welcome, thank you.
Lisa, thank you all for having me today. I had a great time seeing the campus for the first time, and I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, where we are Wildcats fans, which means that all my friends from childhood said I needed to wear a Wildcat costume to talk, which I decided against, but may have made it more entertaining. But I'm delighted to be with you today, and I thought I would start with what I think is a common experience for any of the economists in the room, which is that when you become an economist, suddenly everyone in your circles, your family, your friends, would like to know what they should do on the stock market. So how should they invest? And it turns out I know nothing about that. So I would not be the person to ask about that. But I do think that if I told you that there was some investment that would generate a 3-to-1 return, that for every dollar you invested, you would make back $3 over the long run, you would probably take that bet, right? And I'm not talking about NVIDIA, although if you got in early, I think that probably worked out pretty well for you. What I'm in fact talking about is the topic for today, and really how we think about making wise investments in the earliest years of life. And so what I plan to do today is talk about sort of why economists are even thinking about early childhood. I know this will be very familiar to many in the room, but sort of why is this an area that has drawn attention? And then talk about the evidence on program effectiveness. I'm going to focus, for the most part, on the research on Head Start, a program that has been really a fundamental part of my research agenda for many years. And I think provides us with some policy lessons. The evidence base there, I think, sets us up to think well about, as Lisa said, what is happening at the state level right now in the early childhood space. So how do we sort of move that evidence base into tangible, practical policy and practice? And that will, of course, lead to some open questions that we still need to answer. And so I'll sort of end with a call for, given what we know, where do we need to move from here, and where can we as researchers, we as policymakers set the stage to answer those further questions. So we'll dive in first, sort of why the focus on early childhood. And again, I know that many of you that could give this part of the talk, but we know that there exists large gaps in both what we might think of as cognitive or academic, pre-academic skills, but also in social, behavioral, what economists often call non-cognitive skills at the time that children enter formal schooling. So when they arrive at kindergarten, these gaps already exist. And then we also know that they persist. And we know that early skill development, so some of these foundational skills are really important for later skill development, or what you may have heard Nobel laureate Jim Heckman refer to as skills beget skills. But really this idea that building foundational skills allows you to then continue to progress in your learning and also build this sort of early successful experiences, right? So you have the experience of learning how to read, and that then cascades into further effects. And we know from our developmental psychologist colleagues as well that the young brain is quite valuable and that might be declining in age. So that we want to capitalize on the fact that in the earliest years, children are particularly susceptible to intervention, and their brain architecture is quite susceptible. So to give you an illustration of this, if we look at, for example, IQ scores or a measure of IQ, we could debate about what that measure captures in the solid lines, and then math scores once the lines become dashed. For children whose parents' income is in the highest income quartile in the top panel, and those for whom the parents' income is in the lowest income quartile in the bottom panel, what we see is an opening up of this gap on these measured skills that is in fact at its widest right at about 5 years old when children enter formal schooling, right? And so we see it really non-existent at the earliest times of measurement, and then it widens, and then you see it persists thereafter. And we see this in other types of skills too. So not only in the sort of cognitive skills like literacy and math, this is measured at age 4, and this is an income gradient that we're seeing from the lowest quintile to the highest quintile. But we also see it in exhibiting, for example, problem behaviors. So conduct problems or hyperactivity. We also see this income relationship. And so what does this surface for us? I think 2 sort of key points. One is that these gaps exist in early childhood. By the time children enter school. And so what that does, I think, is point us back to what happened before then. The importance of early home environments, of parenting, sort of all of the experiences that children have before they arrive at school. And then we also see that school is not closing these gaps, which is not to indict what we're doing in K-12 schooling systems entirely, because we don't know what these gaps would look like in the absence of what we currently do. But we do know that they are not closing over those years. And we also know that they then correlate with a number of important later life outcomes like educational attainment, employment, and other measures of later life well-being. And so this points to, I think, early childhood as a really critical period for intervention and thinking about remediating those gaps before they form. And many of you have probably seen or are familiar with what is this sort of stylized depiction known as the Heckman curve, right? The investments we make early in life generate higher rates of return potentially than investments we make later in life. As you may have heard, Heckman quoted to say the accident of birth plays a powerful role in determining adult success. And so why do we think that it exhibits this kind of pattern? Well, the points that I've made so far, but also the complementarities between the investments we make early and then everything we do thereafter, right? So if you have these early skill boosts, and then you also experience the kinds of schooling programs that happen in K-12, and then you maybe experience job training, and that all of those investments are more effective given the fact that you have these early investments. And we also think that it is likely cheaper to invest now than to remediate later, right? Which also sets up this kind of profile. And what that means then is that early childhood interventions may have the feature that is sort of a unicorn in public policy making of being both cost-effective or efficacy enhancing as well as equity enhancing, in that they benefit children from disadvantaged backgrounds disproportionately more, such that they also have this gap closing feature. So today I'm going to talk broadly about the early childhood care and education landscape. I do that intentionally. Lisa mentioned the time that I spent at the White House, and one of the things that I think has become sort of unfortunate in the policy conversation around early childhood investments is that it has become somewhat siloed into specific programs. And I'd like us to think broadly about what that landscape looks like and who it's covering and who it's not covering. And so I'm going to talk about preschool and pre-K, childcare, which may happen in centers, in homes and community-based settings. And I'm going to talk about that all collectively as the ECE landscape. And just to sort of formalize this, in the US, about 55% of children under age 6 who've not yet entered kindergarten participate regularly in some form of ECE, of some non-parental care. This is down slightly from pre-pandemic, I'll just also point out, but we don't know much about what's happening in the post-pandemic ECE landscape. And then importantly, I think it's worth putting on the table that we think about ECE programs as serving a dual purpose. So I focus mostly thus far on talking about children's development, and certainly we think these sorts of investments are directly supporting children's development, but that they also might facilitate parents' engagement in gainful activities, right? Parents' ability to work, to seek more schooling, to participate in training. And so we should keep both of those aims, I think, top of mind when we think about policy for this space. And I just want to also set up the importance of sort of the counterfactual, or sort of when we think about a child participating in a particular setting, what would they otherwise have been doing? Because I think we know that all of the environments in which young children spend time are developmental environments, and they may be more or less rich with developmental support, but all of the environments in which children are spending time are contributing to their growth and development in more or less impactful ways. And so when we think about family socioeconomic status and the inputs into child development, which might be the quantity of inputs or the quality of those inputs, we often think it has some sort of relationship with family socioeconomic status. And here, what I'm depicting is that as families have more resources, we think the quality of those inputs or the quantity of those inputs might increase. I call these home experiences because it could be home or it could be whatever else, whatever other settings children are spending time in. And if we think about an income-targeted early childhood program, so something like Head Start, we think that it is likely, or we hope, going to boost the quantity and quality of inputs that children are experiencing in their early childhood years relative to what they otherwise would have experienced. If we think about a more universal program that serves further up the income distribution, perhaps even the entire income distribution, you can see that the contrast between what children get in that program versus what they would have otherwise experienced, in some cases, over towards the right of the picture, is going to shrink. And in fact, if you went all the way up to the income distribution, it could be the case that children would have otherwise experienced a more developmentally rich environment in their home or with their parents than they do in the setting, right? And so this can be important for us to think about impact of different programs relative to what children would have otherwise experienced. We can also think about this in historical context, which is perhaps this is what historically the relationship between family socioeconomic status and the quality and quantity of child development inputs looks like, but that has improved over time. And we actually have a lot of empirical documentation of this fact, that all parents are doing more in the early childhood years with their children. They're spending more time, and this also has an income gradient, though. So that is that families at the top end of the income distribution are doing more of these developmentally enriching activities and spending. And so then we think about a historical program, maybe the historical Head Start program, which I'll talk a bit about, relative to the historical home experiences. And now maybe that program has improved while simultaneously the outside option has improved, right? That is what children would otherwise experience if they don't get Head Start also looks better now. And that might be in homes, but also the fact that we have more early childhood programming. So we have more alternatives that children might otherwise experience. So turning to the evidence, what I'm going to do now is sort of walk us through what I think are some important sort of guideposts in the empirical evidence base to help us think about policy ramifications. And to think about this, I'm sure I don't have to tell you all, but it's actually a very difficult question to answer, sort of what is the impact of preschool on some long-term outcome that we care about. Here, we might be interested in earnings because it's something that we can often measure, we can consistently measure it. And it is actually a fairly good proxy for what later life well-being, right? So we might use that. So we have a little girl who we would like to be able to observe experiencing preschool and not experiencing preschool. And then we would like to observe her in adulthood and see what her earnings look like. And this is, of course, very difficult to do, right? We can't see her going down both paths. She's going to go down one or the other. So what we ultimately do in the evidence base, in generating this evidence, is we compare a little girl here who goes to preschool to a different little girl who doesn't go to preschool, and now we look at them later in life. And of course, that comparison could potentially be the preschool effect, right? So that the difference in earnings later in life could be due to preschool, But it could also be due to the fact that these two little girls and their families were quite different, and there was something different about them. And in fact, when we look back at data on the early Head Start program, so the Head Start program in its earliest years, there are actually, it's very hard to find comparison children who did not participate in Head Start, but who we think are sort of comparable on all of the other dimensions, that is, from disadvantaged families and that kind of thing. And this continues to this day to be the challenge when we try to do this kind of research. So how well we make this comparison really informs the quality of the evidence. And I'll say that I hope that what I'm showing you today is all really high quality evidence that does a good job of discerning that which is the effect of the ECE programming on outcomes, separate from all of the differences about communities that provide preschool, families that opt into preschool, and so forth. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus for a bit of time on the Head Start program and what we know about the Head Start program's effectiveness. Head Start has really animated my research agenda for many years. And I feel like, as I said, that it's now a rich enough and well-developed evidence base for us to be able to draw some lessons broadly from it. And I love this picture, which was the very early years of Head Start. So Head Start rolled out in 1965 initially. This is in Washington, D.C. in 1966. The First Lady of the United States, Lady Bird Johnson, visiting a Head Start classroom in D.C. And I think a lot about the long-term effects of Head Start. And I would love to know where this little girl is now, because I think it's somewhere very good, because she knows that when the First Lady visits, we should keep quiet. And she's telling her classmates to follow suit. So some non-cognitive skills there, I think, on display. All right, so a brief history of Head Start, which began, as I mentioned, in 1965, was part of the War on Poverty, this broader suite of programs in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. It initially funded a summer program, so it rolled out quite quickly. The administration felt like this was going to be a popular program in the broad suite of what they were doing in the War on Poverty, and so they wanted it to be out in lots of communities across the United States very quickly. And so they served a lot of children initially, 500,000 children in that 8-week summer program. It was a comprehensive, what I'll call, child development program. It was really intended to prepare disadvantaged children from extremely disadvantaged circumstances, I should point out, for school entry. And so it served as a healthcare center, a source of nutrition, parenting information, a community development center. And you can see at the inception, the Head Start grant application focused on medical, cultural, and self-esteem or self-discovery activities. And so you're probably all noting that I have not said anything about academic skills. I haven't mentioned literacy and math and those kinds of skills as being a primary focus, because they weren't a primary focus of the program as it was developed. And it was Lady Bird Johnson, actually, who would travel around the country and talk about the Head Start program and sort of do these stump speeches for it. And one of the things she would say is that these are children who may not have books in the home. They may not have seen a book or sort of understand how to use it and how to look at a book. They may not have been familiar with sitting in a chair and interacting with peers and listening to a teacher. So it was really intended to sort of do all of those things before children entered formal schooling. Today, it serves about 800,000 children to the tune of about $10 billion. Targets families earning income at or below the federal poverty level, and it continues to focus on a range of activities, so health, nutrition, parent involvement, but now there's a much more explicit focus on cognitive and academic skill development in the context of the program. So when you see the program over time, began in 1965 on the dashed line, serving a lot of children, as I mentioned, and then very quickly the program sort of pivoted to being a full year program. There was an understanding that perhaps those 8 weeks in the summer before children entered school was not sufficient to sort of remediate some of the skill gaps and the challenges that children had faced. And so it was pretty quickly transitioned into a full year program in the year prior to school year entry. And so you can see they served fewer children because it was more intensive. And then you see pretty dramatic ramp ups in the 1990s, which have pretty much flattened out, and you see some recent drops sort of in the post-COVID era. And here's how Head Start rolled out across counties in the United States in the earliest years. So the lightest sort of gray here is going to be a county that had Head Start funding by 1966, and then slightly darker by 1968, and then the darkest by 1970. And the white counties that are not shaded did not have Head Start by 1970. And this was actually then fairly stable until the 1990s when there were those big expansions that I just showed you. And there's a body of evidence that has been generated on the effects of Head Start. Here, we're summarizing effects on high school graduation. And so you can see a variety of estimates, positive, some more precisely measured, that is, you can see the smaller standard errors, versus some that are imprecise, but a variety of different approaches, different data sets have all generated fairly consistent evidence that Head Start can affect educational attainment, at least as Head Start was deployed in the 1960s and 1970s, which is the focus of most of these studies. And so given the evidence of long-term effects for some of these early cohorts that were exposed to Head Start, educational attainment improvements, and then another literature about the importance of early, even in utero environment, the importance of family resources during childhood and mother's education for children's outcomes, and another body of evidence on the intergenerational transmission of resources and outcomes and the sort of high correspondence between outcomes in one generation and outcomes in the next generation. We were interested in exploring the intergenerational effects of Head Start. So in some joint work that I have with Andrew Barr, we asked the question of whether Head Start effects transfer across generations. And that is in particular, does Head Start break the cycle of poverty, which was its intention? As I mentioned, a component of the war on poverty. The idea was really to break that cycle. And if you study questions about the war on poverty or Great Society programs, there's always a perfect LBJ quote for you to set up your research pursuit. So here's ours. When he was talking about the program, so this was 1965, this was really as the program is about to roll out across counties and communities across the country. He comments that this is a remarkable accomplishment, how quickly they have gotten it up and running for Americans throughout the country. He says, I believe this response reflects a realistic and wholesome awakening in America. It shows that we are recognizing that poverty perpetuates itself. 5- and 6-year-old children are inheritors of poverty's curse and not its creators. Unless we act, these children will pass it on to the next generation like a family birthmark. So it really is precisely about this intergenerational question. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use, if you think back to that map, the rollout of Head Start across counties in the United States. And we can, we basically know where mothers, what we'll call the first generation, are in the NLSY 79 data sets, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And those mothers in that data were conveniently born around the years that would make them 4 and 5 years old as Head Start was rolling out across the country. We also have Head Start exposure measured in archival records. So we go and find where Head Start programs were, when, which was displayed in that map. And then the NLSY actually surveyed all of the children born to women, which is why we're going to focus on mothers. And so we have the second generation in that data where we can observe their long-term outcomes. And then we also know a bit about the grandmothers, sort of the generation 0, which helps us identify who we think was likely served by Head Start or eligible for Head Start. And so what we find using that variation in counties across the US, so were you the right age when Head Start arrived in your county and were you likely eligible? When we focus on those whose grandmothers had less than high school completion, so we think a likely eligible group in those counties that had Head Start at the right time, what we see is for those not exposed to Head Start, here are their outcomes in terms of not being a teen parent, no criminal engagement, completing high school and going to college. And if you got that shock of Head Start arriving at the just right time, here's how each of those outcomes improved for the second generation. So this is that your mother was in the right place at the right time to be exposed to Head Start. When we look at a slightly less likely to be exposed to the program and perhaps slightly less likely to be affected by the program, that is grandmothers who, we include grandmothers who also had a high school degree, we see some responses, but more muted. Which is consistent with what we would think, right? As I said, this is a group that might not have been eligible, and they also might have had better outcomes even in the absence of exposure to Head Start. And then when we look at a group that we think was very unlikely to have been affected by Head Start, that is grandmothers with more than high school completion in this time frame, right? This is, we're talking about children in the 1960s whose mothers had more than high school completion, which was fairly uncommon. We see no effect of Head Start. We see better outcomes sort of across the board, not surprisingly, and we see no effect of Head Start. And so to summarize, we really find evidence of persistent Head Start effects in the second generation, these increases in educational attainment for the second generation and reductions in engagement in risky behaviors. These effects correspond to approximately $35,000 in sort of earnings, expected earnings. We don't observe that because this is still they're still early enough in their career trajectories for us to be able to capture a stable measure of earnings. So we use the outcomes that we do observe to project that out. And so we think it's about a $35,000 improvement. But also what you might have noticed in those figures is that it essentially brought those bars up to the point where that high impact sample, those with grandmothers with less than high school education, look a lot like that no impact sample, those with more advantaged grandmothers. And so the effects are essentially large enough to effectively close the gap in long-term outcomes between those two groups. So what are some of the mechanisms? We look at it, the first generation, we don't actually see effects on mothers' fertility or family formation. So this isn't that mothers are waiting to have children or having fewer children. There are no real movements on that dimension. But we do see positive effects on the mothers, that is generation one's educational attainment, which is consistent with that body of evidence that I showed you. And then also we see some important improvements in what the second generation experiences. They experience themselves improved parenting behaviors and an improved or enhanced early home environment. And so these mothers are parenting differently, these mothers that were exposed to Head Start. We also see in that generation increased preschool and Head Start attendance. So they are more likely to go themselves. And we see in the intervening period reductions in grade repetition, juvenile crime, improvements in self-esteem. You will see that I am not mentioning test scores, though we do have test scores. We don't see test score improvements for the second generation. And even though we see these important outcomes like educational attainment being realized for that group. And so there was some press coverage of this paper, and I thought it was interesting. Preschool's hidden value may be in combating poverty, but as I just told you, it was not in fact hidden. It was the explicit goal of the program. And so the subtitle here is Head Start may not boost test scores, but researchers find long-term multi-generational benefits in the program. That was explicitly how the program was designed, right? It was to disrupt the transmission of poverty to the next generation. And we know a lot more than just our paper about Head Start effectiveness. So there was an experimental study, the Head Start Impact Study, that was run in the early 2000s. And I will say the upshot of that is there were initial positive effects on cognitive skills. They faded pretty rapidly. And so there was no difference between the Head Start participating children and their non-participating counterparts by first grade and third grade follow-ups. And I should highlight as measured by test scores. But there have been substantial reanalyses of these data that I think have uncovered some important facts for us, a more nuanced picture of the effects of this more recent experimental deployment of Head Start on children's outcomes. So there's a lot of variation in impact by center. You have some very effective centers and ineffective centers, and you should think back to how we talked about the counterfactual. This could be driven by sort of what the other options are in particular communities. There are more pronounced effects among children who would otherwise be in parental or relative care. So again, when we enhance that contrast between what you would experience with the program and what you would have experienced otherwise, seems to be most impactful. And the largest effects were for children with low cognitive skills as measured by the assessments at program entry. And there are indeed persistent effects into the early grades for Spanish-speaking children. So some pockets of where we see some test score effects. And they also, through this study, have documented broader effects on families. So you see durable effects on parenting practices. So if your child got Head Start, parents were more likely to read to their children. They spent more time on math activities, and non-resident fathers spent more time with their children, and those persisted beyond the program year. And we see lots of evidence of increased employment and earning among particularly single mothers in response to the availability or the participation in Head Start. That's one strand of the literature, the experimental study. And then our paper is part of a different literature that uses quasi-experimental designs and looks at the medium and long-term effects. Because of that, it's generally focused on cohorts that participated in the 1960s to the 1990s, right? So sort of backing up, because then we can observe these long-term effects that we can't necessarily observe in the Head Start Impact Study. And I would say the preponderance of evidence there is of particularly increased educational attainment, but some evidence of increased student achievement for Hispanic students, greater economic self-sufficiency, better health, less engagement in risky behaviors. And that's all in the first generation or sort of the exposed generation. And then, as I mentioned, impact on later life parenting practices and spillovers to the second generation. So I think that's where the Head Start literature sort of broadly stands. And there's some suggestion that, initial effects of programs relative to sort of the early deployments of programs like the Perry Preschool Project and Apostarian, which had very large initial effects on children's cognitive skills, have perhaps been declining over time. And you can see Head Start related studies in the sort of pinkish bubbles and other types of preschool programs in the blue bubbles, and some evidence of this sort of declining relationship. But importantly, this is at the end of the program year as measured by cognitive skill measures. And so you could think this is declining program quality, declining contrast with what kids would otherwise do as we've done more preschool programming and parents have done more. But I would say that the picture is much less clear when you look over time at effects on high school graduation, right? Some of this is because these are measured less precisely, but you can see from the variety of studies that I just summarized that actually some big effects are still being realized from the recent cohort. So there's not that same sort of pattern if you look at some of these long-term outcomes. I'm going to jump to talking about Sure Start, a program in the UK that was really modeled after Head Start. And there's a recent study that came out of it that I think also highlights some of these themes. So Sure Start rolled out across England over time. So you can see the number of centers in the bars and the total spending on Sure Start. And this recent work looks at evidence on the impact of the programming on what I'll call short and medium run outcomes. And you can see that the programming, here's sort of what the programming consisted of, actually also reflects a focus on the whole child. So support for parents, community healthcare, those kinds of components are present in Sure Start as well. And what the authors find is on test scores, actually not much happening initially, and some emergence of positive test scores later, which is somewhat interesting. On special education status, initially greater likelihood to be identified for special support, and then that declines over time. And on unexcused absences, again, this sort of pattern of not as much happening in the early years, and then the emergence of big reduction in unexcused absences as children reach adolescence. And so I think this evidence is consistent with what we see in some of the Head Start research, meaningful improvements in human capital development and health, but this interesting sort of pattern that initially more engagement with social services and intervention, and perhaps that's part of the reason why those effects manifest later through early identification for those supports. And estimates of the program's cost effectiveness, even through medium-term outcomes, right? So we haven't even observed the long-term outcomes for these cohorts, suggests that a net cost of the program that's only 10% of its upfront outlay. So it is sort of recapitalized on 90% of that upfront outlay through the kinds of benefits that I just walked through. And so that suggests that if there are long-run benefits over and above that, that it will likely pay for itself. In the Boston Public Preschool Program, which I think is good evidence on a more recent modern day program, where we can look at long-term educational attainment and behavioral effects of this deployment in Boston. So I want to talk you through what we see there. So they're able to look at any college, both immediately after high school or ever, high school graduation, both on time or ever, and whether or not you took the SAT. And this is a randomized study. So they use the fact that there were lotteries into these Boston pre-K programs. And what we see here is that Boston pre-K improves college going. And there's some evidence about the types of colleges that students shift into, but this is really driven through improving high school graduation and increasing the likelihood of taking the SAT. And so I think what we can take away from this is in an experimental setting, in a modern day context, that a public preschool program can generate improvements here in high school completion, SAT testing, and college going, but they also document reductions in school disciplinary infractions and juvenile incarceration, and importantly, no test score effects. So they do not see differences on state achievement test scores. And I think this is interesting because we've got a modern day context, and we have the fact that we still can observe these long-term outcomes of educational attainment that we care about. These effects are larger for boys, I'll also note. And so then what I want to close with is sort of probing this a bit more. So dynamic complementarity. In a Danish preschool study, that was deployed across Denmark in 1933 through 1960. So again, a historical context, but we can look at long-term and intergenerational outcomes using the rollout of this preschool program across Denmark, which you can see expanded quite dramatically across time. They find that access to preschool in early childhood improves adult educational attainment, earning, and survival beyond age 65, with children of preschool exposed mothers also attaining more education. So those second generation effects. And what's interesting here is they can also use a home visiting program that was sort of similarly rolled out across Denmark around the same time. They actually find if you were exposed to the home visiting program, preschool is less effective or less impactful on your outcome, suggesting that these are somewhat substitutable. And these programs were both providing a lot of sort of help information to families. So interestingly enough, it seems like if you got one, you maybe did not benefit as much from the other. But in a US context, we've also thought about complementarities, and this is in the context of Head Start again. So looking at the effects on adult outcomes of both Head Start and different levels of K through 12 spending. And so Johnson and Jackson are able to do this, and they find that Head Start and increased K through 12 spending led to higher educational attainment and earnings, reduced poverty, reduced interaction with the criminal justice system in adulthood. I'll just sort of quickly show you. You can see, if you look at the left side in particular, among poor children with more K through 12 spending, Head Start access means more. And on in the white bars with Head Start exposure, K through 12 spending also was more impactful. So there are in fact these complementarities in this type of spending. So the benefits of Head Start were larger when they were followed by access to better funded schools, or alternatively, you can think of this increases in K through 12 spending to produce better outcomes when it was preceded by exposure to Head Start. So all of this is to say that the evidence on ECE experiences, including childcare, Head Start, and other preschool programs can positively affect a variety of what we think are very important outcomes. Children's short-term outcomes, including school readiness, early social, emotional, and cognitive skill development, but in particular, children's long-term outcomes, such as educational attainment, executive function, employment, and earnings. And I've also briefly talked about parental, in particular, maternal employment benefiting from exposure to these programs. And then importantly, societal outcomes through the greater productivity of those exposed and their parents, and which can generate economic growth. And I think this is not to say, I want to highlight that there aren't exceptions. Some of you are probably thinking of some of those exceptions. I mentioned the lack of effects in early grades on average in the Head Start impact study. There are also no even negative findings in that same time frame of the early childhood or the early primary grade years in Tennessee's voluntary pre-K program. And there's some earlier Head Start literature that uses family fixed effects designs that presents a more mixed picture. So you might have heard of some of those things, and I didn't want to gloss over them. I think we largely don't rely on the design of family fixed effects anymore, where we would compare for example, Head Start exposed child to a non-Head Start exposed child in the same family, because of some evidence that it's a certain type of family that really selects into that kind of identification, but also that there's new evidence from the Perry Preschool Project of substantial spillovers from the participating child to non-participating children in the family. And I talked about effects on parents. If we think that these programs potentially affect parenting practices and parenting behaviors, or lead to parents being more likely to be employed or receive more education themselves, then you can imagine how that would affect all children in the family, not just the focal child. So moving from that, what we know from the evidence base, to how we think about policy and practice. So I think despite the body of evidence that I just walked through, which I think demonstrates sort of the proof of concept that we can deploy these kinds of programs in cost-effective ways that generate greater return on the public dollar than that which was initially invested, I think there's some important questions that remain about the landscape and about sort of what economists might call the market, but just this sort of more broadly, can families access a well-functioning market? Can they find the care that meets their needs? And is the supply of these kinds of high quality options that do indeed generate good effects sufficient from society's perspective? We know that there are big differences in preschool participation for low income families in the blue line, high income families in the orange line, and that there was this big shock from COVID and we haven't fully rebounded from that. We see stark differences by mother's level of education, again, and we see differences by race and ethnicity, in particular that Hispanic children are participating at much lower rates. And so this suggests that there are some places in the system where families are not able to access what they need. We can also ask them about that. And there's a national survey that asks about your difficulty finding care. And what you see is across the income distribution, parents who report difficulty are often reporting costs. That's the dark blue bar. That's more pronounced at the low end of the income distribution. But lots of parents are also saying capacity, the availability of slots. That's the sort of brighter blue bar. And you can see that's true even for high income families. And when we have centers, if they experience excess demand, that is, they turn families away or they operate a wait list, about 73% of them say they do one of those two things. So it suggests that there is a lot of unmet need as measured by this measure. And you can see that's particularly pronounced for centers that serve the youngest children and in high density urban areas. So that's where you can really see some of these frictions at play. And so there is this persistent gap between the cost providing high quality early childhood care and education and the prices that families can afford. And what I think that suggests from a sort of broad perspective is that both sides of this market need attention, that subsidies and incentives that could both help families that are looking for ECE for their children and for providers that are supplying that those programs could play an important role in addressing these challenges. Supply side subsidies tied to the cost of providing that high quality care could ensure that providers actually make those investments, either in the workforce or in other ways to improve quality, and adjusting the price that consumers pay based on their income makes it easier for families to accommodate high quality care in their budgets. And so where do we go from here? I will wrap up for questions. So as I said, I think there's pretty clear, compelling evidence that ECE programs can alter children's trajectories in meaningful ways. That has implications, of course, for their own well-being, for their families, but also for all of us, right? And so I think we should take from that there is an opportunity here for us to capitalize on those benefits and to realize those benefits more broadly. We're always going to be chasing the long-term effects of currently operating programs. And so from a policy perspective, this is very difficult because we can't answer the question of how effective a program that is operating right now is at improving children's long-term outcome. So in the absence of that, we can't time travel. So I think we're going to need to get better at measuring the intermediary outcomes that correspond to better life chances so that we can then say, here's the pathway on which we think these long-term improvements that really matter may be realized, and we can measure that more quickly. And counterfactual conditions have certainly changed a lot over time in ways that are often difficult for us to measure. We have a dearth of high quality data in this space, which makes it difficult for us to know what families are doing in the absence of the specific programs that we do capture in data. So what we need to know is a lot, but I think we're on that path. We need to know what works for whom, in which settings, what are the features that matter, the processes that matter, what are the outcomes that are affected, and as compared to what, and then how do we move this to scale? So what are the essential ingredients? What are the mechanisms, the pathways, as I mentioned, through which long-term effects are realized? Really, how do we best organize this system of early care and education support around ensuring quality and ensuring that families are not falling in the gaps of that fragmented system? So how do we optimally deploy both demand side and supply side investments in this space? So I think the focus for early childhood policy and research moving forward is around resolving this tension between promoting access and promoting quality. So how do we do more slots and more coverage, but do it well in ways that essentially widen that gap between what I would otherwise experience and what I'm now getting, right? And sort of improve the developmental inputs that I'm experiencing. How do we define and identify high quality? What is the role of targeting programs versus more universal programs? And how does that matter for the realization of impact? And how do we then take all of that to understand replication and scale up? And so we do have some of this happening. There's program features that have been tested, small class size, full day of learning, specific curriculum, coaching supports that show promise. We know caregiver-child relationships are key to quality. That's been well documented, and that points to the effectiveness of investing in the workforce and ensuring that we reduce turnover and that those high quality caregivers are staying in this profession. And then we also know, interestingly, that universal programs can be cost effective, even relative to targeted programs, which we might not think, sort of initially, like if the kids that are going to benefit most are the kids from disadvantaged families, we should target the kids from disadvantaged families. But actually, universal programs do quite well in improving children's outcomes. And so we should take that knowledge and use it. So moving beyond the does preschool work debate, which I hope we will do, to really thinking about these next stage of questions, focusing on the dual role that ECE plays in families' lives. That is both that we can promote children's development and we can support families and their attachment to the labor force. We need to better understand the development of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and we need to better measure those skills. Studying workforce investments, I think this is a really important area that we have done not as much work, and how those workforce investments improve program quality and child outcomes as a result. Understanding the complementarity and substitutability of human capital investments, especially given the many environments in which children spend time. And a last point that I think is crucially important, and I'm very worried in the current state of affairs about our commitment to this, but is the data infrastructure that allows us to understand where children are, what they're experiencing, what it costs to families, and how high quality that experience is, to allow us to investigate all of these questions of importance. So we really don't know what's happening in the market. We don't have the data that allows us to do that. And then that data allows us to also study the impact of the investments we're making. So that high quality data is, I think, crucial. And I will.
So we have until 5:30 to open for Q&A.
Hi. So I was just wondering, do we know if like prenatal stress can biologically impact? Oh, excuse me. Do we know if prenatal stress biologically widens these developmental gaps in children?
So it's a great question, and we do know some about it. In fact, people in this room know more about this than I do. But we do think that we think maternal stress is important for children's developmental outcomes, and in particular, prenatal stress and prenatal environments are very important for children's development. When you think about earlier is better for both preventing negative shocks and also potentially doing these kinds of investments, we mean even when children are developing in utero. And so we do know that that's an important piece of this. And I think that what that points to, so I sort of stated a couple facts that said, this points to those early environments, parenting, and what children are experiencing in those earliest years. The kinds of policies that then we would think about addressing maternal stress in while carrying a child look pretty different, right, than these kinds of what I've talked about today. But I think it's super important for thinking about children's development.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I work for a migrant seasonal Head Start. And if you haven't heard of a migrant seasonal Head Start before, that is a Head Start program that is primarily eligibility is based on working in the agricultural sector. We actually have programming in South Bend.
I know.
And so my question is, we work in family child care. And, this has been going through many changes impacting COVID, I would say, towards investment and improvement there. But there has been some barriers towards proving efficacy. So I wonder about any potential policy impacts we could make or data that we should be particularly looking at in order to prove that this is a quality way of delivering Head Start or just early childhood service.
And you're specifically asking about that, which is it provided in family
child care home.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question, and I think very understudied. One of the things I've been talking to some policymakers who provide support to providers in that space, and coaching and that sort of thing to improve their levels of quality. And they have some evidence that the programs that they work with advanced in the state's quality rating system, but they would really like to more sort of rigorously test the impact of these kinds of services. And one of the things I said to them was, I think that would be great because I think it would be very informative to the to policymakers and practitioners writ large, because I don't think we know much about this space and improving quality of the space. To the point about data infrastructure, we have even less data about what is happening in that part of the broader ECE landscape. And I think it's unfortunate because I don't think our goal should be that we are moving all families into a particular type of care, which is why I talk broadly about the ECE landscape. We know that there are families that don't want their child to be in a center or would prefer the place down the street that's pretty conveniently located, where the provider speaks the language that they speak at home, or whatever those features might be. And so I hope that where we move with policy is, rather than everyone staying in their own lanes, is to think broadly about who's falling through the gaps of that existing infrastructure and how do we improve quality in each of these lanes such that families and children are experiencing high quality settings, regardless of the kinds of settings that they're choosing. So I think it's a great question, and I unfortunately can't say much to what we know because I think it's an area where we really need to know more.
Have one on Zoom. Is it a mistake to not consider the effects of historical systemic racism on children and families in terms of ECE? You haven't mentioned race in context of the studies in this area.
I think it's hugely important to think about, and you know, I will mention that racism is certainly a very intertwined part of Head Start's history. So, you know, one of the interesting things about the design of Head Start is that it flowed directly into those communities that I showed you across the country. This was intentional to circumvent racist governors in the South who said, we will not provide this programming to Black children. We won't do it. And so the Johnson administration said, then we're not going to go through the states. So you'll notice that Medicaid, TANF, lots of other programs we can talk about flow through states who then deploy those resources in their state. That is not how Head Start was set up, intentionally to circumvent those governors and to get programming directly to children. So it's an important piece of this, and I showed you the disparities in participation by race and ethnicity. And I think it is a sign to me that the system is not working well when we see those disparities. And so I think we should very much be focused in the broader ECE policy conversation about how we ensure that that programs are serving families and all families and ensuring that they get what they need. This is also part of the reason why I'm concerned about us thinking about sort of like some program types are better than other program types, because families have preferences that stem from their experiences of different systems, and I think they should be certainly empowered to act on those preferences. And so that's why I think it's important to think about the landscape serving their needs in whatever setting is going to best match that. And we should be deploying public dollars to best facilitate those matches.
I'm here, thank you. Oh, thanks for being here, by the way. I know nothing about early childhood. You'll see that when I ask this first question. That is, when you talk about the gap in the very, very beginning of your presentation, was that the gap between the two groups, whatever you were comparing, or the gap from where you want everyone to be?
So great question. The gap is between those two groups. So
and why don't we look at the gap also from where we want people to have achieved?
It's you know, so it's a great point, because what we might say is there are certain skills and competencies that we would like children to be able to demonstrate when they enter school. And so let's measure their skills relative to some benchmark. And actually, if we were able to do that, which we're generally not particularly well equipped for given the data that we have, we would be able to answer a lot of questions that I think are difficult to tease apart in the data that we currently observe. Like, we would be able to say, when we have some kids who participate in preschool and they come into kindergarten and some of their counterparts have not, and then we look at their scores at the end of kindergarten or at the end of first grade, and the gap between them has closed. Was that because some sort of deterioration in the skills of the preschool kids, or what we might call fade out? You may have heard that term used in this space. Or was it that the teacher, seeing what was before him or her in the classroom, most likely her, if we're talking about kindergarten, but said, we should catch up these kids that are not exhibiting these skills. She may not even know that they went to preschool or not, but she's going to remediate the skill deficits for some group of kids. And in that situation where they are caught up to the level of their preschool participating peers, they're going to look the same at the end of kindergarten and the same at the end of first grade. But that's actually a positive effect of preschool, that only some of the class had to be remediated on those dimensions. And so if we had more objective measures of skill and what we would like children to be able to do, we would certainly benefit from being able to compare to that. But I think what we currently do is say the most resourced children from the most resourced and most advantaged families are exhibiting these kinds of skills at kindergarten entry. And so that what that suggests is that there is something, that we could do for the families from the most disadvantaged backgrounds to ensure that they are exhibiting those same skills and are set on a good foundation to pursue the rest of their schooling.
I have one more question, and that is, the micro school movement is gaining some real momentum right now. Obviously, particularly in the private setting, and much of what they are trying to do through technology. There's a movement in that direction. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the use of technology in the early childhood movement, the preschool movement. Is that something you're looking at? Should we be looking at, or should we move away from that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and people are exploring this. I mean, I would say my initial reaction to it in general has been one of concern, because I think we just sort of worry. I at least worry. I have 4 children at various developmental stages, and so I do worry about when and how we attach children to more technology and what that means then for their trajectories thereafter. I do think, however, that there's some very promising evidence that we can use technology to support parents in what they're doing with their children, and so to provide them with the kinds of tools and equip them with books and that kind of thing, via tablets or via text messages or whatever it might be. And I think that evidence is actually pretty promising, that we can do at large scale these kinds of investments in parents that will reach a lot of families at pretty low cost, to really just emphasize the importance of development and the investments parents can make in that space. And I will just say about, sort of technology as a way to build skills, perhaps there's some promise there. I think what we know about these early childhood settings is that children are also developing social skills, and they're learning how to behave in an environment and interact with others and interact with a caregiver that is not their parent. And I think those things are important too, and can likely not be supplanted by technology. And so, as I said, I think we need to be better about measuring these different kinds of skills that these programs affect, and understanding the pathways towards improving social, emotional, behavioral skills, because that's the part that would help us understand what programming is effective and what programming might not realize those same benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have one final question on Zoom. You mentioned the importance of having high quality programming. Is there a quality level where you start to see diminishing returns? Trying to think about how to devote resources to improve quality of existing programming versus to expand supply and access.
Great question. So I think quality is important. I don't know that we measure quality very comprehensively. I think we know what some dimensions of quality are. And as I mentioned, I think we really think that caregiver-child relationship is one of the key pieces of that. So I think being able to measure that attachment, or being able to measure, for example, turnover, which might work against those sort of healthy child caregiver relationships, seems like dimensions of quality that we should better capture. But beyond some of the things that I mentioned, so full day, small class sizes or small ratios, a curriculum that is provided with coaching, we don't actually have a whole lot of evidence of how we should define quality writ large. And I think there is this question, I mentioned the tension between, should we expand access, that is, should we provide to more kids some type of programming in this broad ECE landscape, or should we intensify the services that some kids are experiencing, right? Should we provided for a longer school day, or as Head Start did in the early years, a longer school year, is a really tough sort of trade-off to make when you don't have great information about the quality piece and where those investments would best be made. The way that I generally think about it is taking us back to those very early slides on the counterfactual and sort of what compared to what. For some kids, moving them into a program, so providing a program when they would have otherwise been in some other program or some other kind of high quality developmental environment, where they were getting a lot of inputs to their development. Expanding access in that case is not going to make a lot of sense for the use of the public dollar, right? For some kids, moving from nothing, being at home, maybe with a relative or, sort of in care where they're not getting those kinds of developmental support and those interactions with other kids, moving them into something, expanding coverage would make a big difference. But then you have instances where there are kids who are all in maybe family childcare homes and that kind of thing. And then what we should do is focus on improving the quality in those settings, right? And so going into those settings and understanding what's being delivered and how might we improve upon that. So what I think this takes is a really concerted effort to think about where the gaps are, where can we make the most, sort of generate the most return on the use of that public dollar. And I think sometimes that's in access and sometimes that's in improving quality. But to get there and make those decisions, we do have to understand and measure quality more comprehensively than we currently do. Thank you.
There is actually one more question.
Oh, there was a question.
I think we're at time. Yeah, sorry. Okay, thank you. Well, there is a reception. I hope that you can stay and enjoy food and drink, and Chloe can answer more questions. But I also hope that all of you will join us for our next Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture on November 4th with Brian Daniel, the Executive Director of Chapin Hall. And he'll be talking about child welfare and family. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.